A billionaire refused to pay the man who built his mansion. He tore up the contract and said, "Sue me if you can." But the builder's son found something the billionaire didn't expect. A forgotten law. One word that could freeze his entire empire: lien. A week later, his accounts were locked. His deal collapsed, and the builder got paid triple. He tried to cheat a craftsman. Instead, he taught him how to win. For 40 years, Javier Castillo had spoken a language of sweat, wood, and stone. He was a master contractor, a man whose hands, gnarled and stained with the memory of 1,000 projects, could read the soul of a house. He could tell the age of a support beam by its scent, diagnose a foundation's flaw by a hairline crack invisible to any other eye. He had come to this country from Mexico with nothing but a toolbox and a relentless work ethic, and had built a small, respected construction business on a foundation of pure, unshakable integrity. His work was his bond. His reputation was his temple. At 62, he was nearing the end of his career, planning to pass the business to his American-born son, Mateo. He had one last big project to complete, a final masterpiece that would serve as his legacy and secure his family's future. A full, gut renovation of a historic mansion in the city's most exclusive, old-money neighborhood. The homeowner was a man named Alastair Finch, a third-generation finance mogul who had inherited a fortune he had never worked a day in his life to earn. Finch was a man who moved through the world with the bored, effortless arrogance of someone for whom money was not a tool, but an extension of his own will. He treated Javier not as a master craftsman, but as a serf, a nameless, faceless laborer whose only purpose was to realize his vision. Throughout the 6-month project, Finch was a constant, unnerving presence. He would walk through the bustling construction site in his pristine, hand-stitched Italian loafers, pointing out microscopic flaws in a newly plastered wall, demanding last-minute, impossible changes to the blueprints, and speaking to Javier and his crew in a tone of voice usually reserved for misbehaving dogs. Javier endured it all with a quiet, stoic patience. He was a professional. He had dealt with difficult clients before. The work was the only thing that mattered. And the work was beautiful. Javier poured his entire life's knowledge into that house. He restored the intricate, century-old woodwork by hand. He reinforced the foundation with a technique he had learned from his own grandfather. He turned a decaying, neglected relic into a breathtaking fusion of historic elegance and modern luxury. The project was completed on time and on budget, a minor miracle in the world of high-end construction. On the final day, Javier walked through the silent, perfect house with Finch, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. This was his testament. This was the work of his life. The final invoice was for $250,000, the last payment that covered the immense cost of materials and the salaries for his loyal, hard-working crew. A week passed. No payment. Javier called Finch's office. The secretary was polite but firm. "Mr. Finch is traveling. He will settle the account upon his return." Another week passed. Javier's own accounts were running dry. He had paid his suppliers and his men out of his own pocket, trusting in the contract he had signed. The calls to Finch's office became more frequent, more urgent. The answers became colder, more dismissive. Finally, after a month of silence, he found Finch at the property, directing a team of landscapers as if Javier didn't exist. Javier approached him, the unpaid invoice in his hand. "Mr. Finch," he began, his voice steady despite the anger simmering in his gut. "The final payment is now 30 days overdue. My men have families to feed." Finch turned to him slowly, a look of bored, theatrical surprise on his face. "The payment? Oh, that. There was a problem." He gestured vaguely at the magnificent, newly restored mansion. "The quality of the work. It's not up to my standards. The finish in the guest bathroom is uneven. I believe I saw a slight discoloration on the marble in the foyer. Frankly, I feel I have already overpaid for such shoddy craftsmanship." Javier stared at him, speechless. The accusations were not just lies. They were a profound, personal insult, a desecration of his life's work. "The work is perfect," Javier said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You signed off on every stage. We have the documents." Finch let out a short, ugly laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Documents? You have paper. I have a team of lawyers who eat men like you for breakfast. You are a small, insignificant man, Mr. Castillo. You think you can fight me? Sue me, please. By the time this gets to court, your little business will be bankrupt and your family will be on the street. Now, get off my property." He turned his back, dismissing Javier as he would a fly, and began to instruct the gardeners on the precise placement of a rose bush. In that moment of profound, absolute injustice, standing in the shadow of the masterpiece he had built, Javier felt the full, crushing weight of a system that was designed to protect the powerful from the principled. He had been robbed in plain sight, and the man who had robbed him had just dared him to do something about it. Javier drove away from the mansion in his old, dinted work truck, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The cool, arrogant cruelty of Alistair Finch's dismissal echoed in his mind. It wasn't just the theft of the money. It was the contempt, the casual, unthinking destruction of his honor. For 40 years, his name had been his most valuable asset, a synonym for quality and integrity in a trade filled with corner cutters and fly-by-nighters. In a single, 5-minute conversation, Finch had tried to turn that name to ash. That night, the Castillo family home, usually a place of warmth and boisterous laughter, was shrouded in a heavy, anxious silence. Javier sat at the head of the dining table, the unpaid invoice and the signed contract spread out before him like the relics of a lost cause. His wife, Maria, watched him, her face a mask of worry. His son, Mateo, a bright, intense 22-year-old in his second year of law school, read the documents, his expression growing darker with every page. "He can't do this," Mateo said, his voice a low, angry hum. "The contract is ironclad. You have the sign-offs for every phase. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on." "He doesn't need one," Javier said, his voice heavy with a lifetime of hard-won experience. "He has money. He knows we can't afford to fight him. His lawyers will drown us in motions, in delays. It would take years. By then, the business will be gone. Our savings will be gone. Everything." It was the classic rich man strategy, not to win in court, but to win by attrition, to bankrupt the righteous until they could no longer afford to fight for the truth. They were trapped. To sue would be to commit financial suicide. To do nothing would be to accept the theft and the humiliation, to let Finch win. For a week, Javier was a ghost. He went through the motions of running his small business, but the fire in his eyes was gone. He was forced to lay off 2 of his most loyal men, an act that felt like a physical amputation. He saw the fear in his wife's eyes, the quiet desperation as she reviewed their dwindling bank accounts. The injustice of it was a slow-acting poison, sickening him from the inside out. He had played by the rules his entire life, and the rules had failed him. It was Mateo who refused to surrender. While Javier saw a dead end, Mateo saw a puzzle, a complex legal problem that had to have a solution. He spent every waking hour outside of his classes in the university's law library, not studying for his exams, but hunting. He was not yet a lawyer, but he had a lawyer's mind, methodical, relentless, and driven by a cold, righteous anger. He ignored the high-profile, expensive routes of corporate litigation. He knew they couldn't fight Finch on his own turf. He had to find a different battlefield. He began digging into the obscure, forgotten corners of property and construction law, the dusty, unglamorous statutes that had been on the books for centuries. He found the weapon he was looking for in a dusty, leather-bound volume on the history of trade guilds. It was an ancient, powerful, and almost forgotten legal tool called a mechanic's lien. It was a law designed centuries ago to protect craftsmen from exactly this kind of aristocratic theft. It was simple, brutal, and beautiful in its logic. It stipulated that if a contractor, laborer, or supplier was not paid for work or materials that improved a property, they could place a legal claim, a lien, directly against the property itself. The lien was a cloud on the title, a legal stain that made it impossible for the owner to sell, refinance, or transfer the property until the debt was paid in full. It was a tool of the powerless, a way to hold the castle itself hostage until the king paid his masons. Mateo worked with a quiet, furious intensity. He drafted the lien document himself, his legal training finally finding a purpose that felt real, that felt vital. He meticulously attached copies of the signed contract, the phased sign-offs, the final, unpaid invoice. He built a perfect, irrefutable paper trail. He didn't need a high-powered law firm. He didn't need a lengthy, expensive court battle. All he needed was a filing fee and a trip to the county clerk's office. It was a quiet, bureaucratic act of war. "What is this?" Javier asked, as Mateo laid the thick, professionally prepared document on the dining table. "That," Mateo said, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face for the first time in weeks, "is our justice. Finch thinks his money is his fortress. We are not going to attack the fortress. We are going to seize the ground it stands on. He told you to sue him. We're not going to sue him. We're going to put a lien on his house. Let's see how he likes it when his multi-million-dollar masterpiece has a $250,000 stain on it that he can't wash away." Javier stared at his son, at the fierce intelligence in his eyes, at the quiet, deadly confidence in his voice. The despair that had settled in his heart for weeks began to recede, replaced by a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time: hope. The filing of the mechanic's lien was a silent, invisible act, a single entry in a dusty county ledger. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The silence from Alistair Finch's camp was absolute. Javier began to fear that their gambit had failed, that Finch had found some other, more powerful legal loophole to exploit. He and Mateo existed in a state of suspended animation, the quiet before a storm they weren't sure was even coming. The storm broke not with a phone call from a lawyer, but with a sleek, black Mercedes pulling up in front of the Castillo's modest, well-kept home. Alistair Finch got out of the car. He was not dressed in his usual casual, aristocratic attire. He was wearing a dark, severe suit, his face a thundercloud of pure, unadulterated fury. He strode up the walkway and hammered on the door. Javier opened it to find the billionaire standing on his doorstep, his face a mask of purple rage. "What have you done?" Finch hissed, his voice a low, venomous growl. "You have no idea the trouble you have just caused for yourself, old man." Javier, standing in the doorway of the home he had built with his own 2 hands, felt no fear. He felt only a cold, hard calm. "I did what you told me to do," he said, his voice even. "I am protecting my work. Now, get off my property." The reversal of Finch's own words, delivered with such quiet, unshakable dignity, seemed to stun the billionaire into a momentary silence. Finch's problem, as Mateo had predicted, was not just about the money. He was in the final stages of a massive corporate merger, a deal that required him to leverage his personal assets, including the newly renovated mansion, as collateral. The lien, that insignificant $250,000 stain, had shown up on the title search like a red flag on a balance sheet. The banks had frozen the deal. His entire, multi-billion-dollar empire was being held hostage by a piece of paper filed by a law student. Finch's tone shifted from rage to a kind of venomous negotiation. "This is a shakedown," he spat. "Fine. You want your money? I will pay you. I will pay you the $250, and you will remove this parasitic attachment to my property. Now." It was Javier's turn to smile, a slow, grim, and deeply satisfying smile. "No," he said quietly. Mateo had prepared him for this moment. "The contract you signed specifies a penalty for late payment. 30 days late. The penalty is 100% of the outstanding balance. And there are the legal fees for filing the lien. And there is the matter of the damages to my company's reputation and the wages for the men I had to lay off. The new amount to remove the lien is not $250,000. It is $750,000. Triple the original amount. My son, the lawyer, will be sending your lawyers the new invoice this afternoon." Finch stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He, Alistair Finch, was being outmaneuvered, outnegotiated, by a simple contractor and his upstart son. The sheer, magnificent injustice of it, from his perspective, was breathtaking. He was trapped. To fight the lien in court would take months, by which time his merger would have collapsed, a failure that would cost him hundreds of millions. To pay was to surrender, to admit that he had been beaten. "This is extortion," he finally roared. "It is the cost of doing business, Mr. Finch," Javier replied, his voice still quiet, still calm. "The price of a lesson you should have learned a long time ago. You must always pay the men who build your castle." He then did something he would replay in his mind for years. He quietly and deliberately closed the door in the billionaire's face, leaving him standing on the porch, a king who had just been checkmated by a pawn. The check for $750,000 arrived by courier the next morning. It was not accompanied by a letter of apology, only a cold, one-line legal document demanding the immediate removal of the lien, which Mateo filed with a triumphant grin. For the Castillo family, it was more than just money. It was a vindication, a restoration of a world that had been thrown off its axis. Javier immediately rehired his men, giving them back pay and a substantial bonus for their loyalty. The business, which had been on the brink of collapse, was now more financially secure than it had ever been. The story of the contractor who had brought the ruthless Alastair Finch to his knees became a quiet legend in the city's construction community, a modern-day fable of David and Goliath whispered with a mixture of awe and admiration on job sites and in union halls. Javier became a reluctant hero, a symbol of integrity for the working man. But for Mateo, the victory was the beginning of something new. The experience had ignited a fire in him, a passion for a specific kind of justice he had only ever read about in textbooks. He saw that the law was not just a tool for the rich to protect their power. It could also be a weapon for the powerless to reclaim it. He changed his focus in law school, shifting from the lucrative world of corporate law to the grittier, more vital world of labor and contract law. He started a small, pro bono clinic at his university, offering free legal advice to other small contractors, day laborers, and immigrant workers who were being exploited by unscrupulous developers and homeowners. He used the story of his father's battle and the elegant, powerful tool of the mechanic's lien as his primary case study. He was teaching other Davids how to fight their own Goliaths. Alastair Finch, meanwhile, retreated back into his world of quiet, bitter luxury. His merger went through, but the victory felt hollow. He had been publicly, if quietly, humiliated. His reputation for ruthless invincibility had been shattered. He had been forced to pay, but the real cost was the knowledge that he was not, in fact, untouchable. The story of the lien became a cautionary tale in the city's elite circles, a reminder that even the smallest gear in the machine could, if pushed too far, bring the entire engine to a grinding halt. The mansion, his masterpiece, was now tainted, a monument not to his power, but to his defeat. The story could have ended there, a simple, satisfying tale of justice served. But Finch was not a man who forgave, and he was certainly not a man who forgot. He saw in Mateo not just a one-time adversary, but a future threat, a young, brilliant, and principled lawyer with a personal vendetta, who was now arming the very people Finch and his colleagues had built their fortunes on exploiting. This was not just a personal insult. It was a threat to his entire way of life. And so, he began to move his own pieces on the board, to plan a different kind of revenge, one that would be fought not with liens and contracts, but in the shadows. A few months later, as Javier's business was thriving, a series of strange, inexplicable problems began to arise. A major delivery of expensive, custom-milled lumber for a new project was accidentally rerouted and delayed for 3 weeks, causing a catastrophic scheduling delay. A city building inspector, a man Javier had known for 20 years, suddenly became a bureaucratic nightmare, flagging his site for a dozen minor, previously ignored code violations, threatening to shut down the entire project. Javier's oldest and most reliable suppliers suddenly, and without explanation, terminated their 30-year line of credit. Javier felt a cold, familiar dread. These were not coincidences. This was a coordinated attack. It was Finch, pulling the invisible strings of his power, a silent, wealthy puppeteer trying to slowly, methodically, and deniably strangle his business to death. The attacks were subtle, professional, and utterly deniable. Each problem, viewed in isolation, looked like a normal, if unfortunate, part of doing business. But taken together, they formed a clear, suffocating pattern. Javier was being systematically dismantled. His reputation for being on time and on budget, the very cornerstone of his business, was being destroyed. He was losing money, he was losing clients, and he was losing hope. He confronted Mateo one evening, his face etched with a weary despair. "He is a monster, Mateo. We won the battle, but he is winning the war. I cannot fight a ghost. He is everywhere, and he is nowhere." Mateo, however, was no longer just a passionate student. He was a budding legal strategist. "No, Papa," he said, his eyes a cold, hard fire. "He is not a ghost. He is just a man. And every man, no matter how powerful, leaves a trail. He thinks he's being clever, using proxies and middlemen. But he's arrogant, and arrogance makes men sloppy. Matteo began a new, even more dangerous investigation. He didn't just see a delayed lumber shipment. He saw a trucking company. He spent a week digging into its corporate records and found that it was a subsidiary of a larger logistics firm, which was, in turn, owned by a holding company whose board of directors included Alastair Finch. He didn't just see a difficult building inspector. He saw a man. He investigated the inspector's finances and found a recent, unexplained cash deposit into his wife's bank account, a deposit that was made just 2 days after the first failed inspection. He didn't just see a supplier terminating a line of credit. He saw a bank where Alastair Finch sat on the board of commercial loans. It was a web of influence, a network of quiet corruption, and Matteo was beginning to map it, node by invisible node. The work was dangerous. He was no longer just a student filing a lien. He was a private investigator digging into the dirty laundry of one of the city's most powerful men. He received a quiet warning from one of his law professors, a man with his own connections downtown. "Be careful, son," the professor had said over coffee. "There are hornets' nests you don't want to kick. Alastair Finch is one of them." But Matteo was his father's son. He was relentless. The final piece of evidence came from a source he never expected. One of the other contractors who had been exploited by Finch, a man who had heard the story of Javier's victory and had come to Matteo's pro bono clinic for help, had a story. He had been forced to do a side job at Finch's mansion, installing a high-end, off-the-books security system. As part of the job, he had been given access to the home's network server. And on that server, he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, a folder of audio files, recordings of every phone call made from the mansion's landline. It was the paranoid act of a man who trusted no one. The contractor, a tech-savvy immigrant from Eastern Europe, had quietly made a copy. He gave the encrypted hard drive to Matteo. "This man is a snake," the contractor had said, "and a snake's own venom is the best antidote." Matteo sat in his small dorm room, the sound of his own heart hammering in his ears as he listened to the audio files. And he found it. A recording of a phone call between Alastair Finch and the head of the Building Inspectors Union. The conversation was a masterpiece of coded language, of veiled threats and promised favors. But the message was clear. Finch was calling in a marker, demanding that Javier Castillo's project be buried under a mountain of red tape. It was the smoking gun, a direct, undeniable link between Finch and the conspiracy to destroy his father's business. It was more than enough for a civil suit. It was enough for a criminal investigation into bribery and racketeering. Matteo now held the power not just to save his father, but to put Alastair Finch in a place where his money and his influence could not save him, a prison cell. This time, there was no quiet, personal confrontation. Matteo took the hard drive and his entire, meticulously compiled dossier of evidence not to a county clerk, but to the one place in the city that Alastair Finch could not control, the United States Attorney's Office. He met with a federal prosecutor, a woman with a reputation for being an incorruptible bulldog, and laid out the entire story, from the initial, fraudulent invoice to the web of corruption and the final, damning audio recording. The prosecutor listened in stunned, fascinated silence. This was not just a case of a scammed contractor. This was a textbook case of federal racketeering, a conspiracy to use interstate commerce to intimidate and destroy a business. The full, formidable power of the federal government was now aimed directly at Alastair Finch. The arrest of Alastair Finch on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and racketeering was a bombshell that rocked the city to its core. The story was on the front page of every newspaper, a shocking tale of a powerful billionaire brought down by the relentless determination of a contractor and his law student son. The trial was short and brutal. The audio recording was undeniable. Finch's network of influence shattered, his powerful friends running for cover. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. His empire, built on a foundation of arrogance and contempt, had crumbled to dust. Javier Castillo got his business back. With the pressure from the corrupt inspector and suppliers gone, he was able to complete his projects, his reputation for integrity now stronger than ever. But he did not finish his career as planned. His son's victory had inspired him. He and Mateo used a portion of the original settlement money and the new influx of business to expand Mateo's legal clinic. They founded the Castillo Justice Project, a nonprofit dedicated to providing top-tier legal representation for small, family-run, and minority-owned businesses in their fights against powerful corporate interests. Javier, with his 40 years of industry experience, served as the lead investigator, the man who could read a contract and a construction site like a book. Mateo, who graduated at the top of his class, was the lead litigator, the man who could turn that knowledge into a weapon. One evening, a year after Finch's conviction, Javier and Mateo stood on the balcony of their new, larger office, looking out at the glittering city skyline. They had just won a major case for a group of immigrant welders who had been cheated out of their wages by a massive development corporation. "You know," Javier said, a quiet, proud smile on his face, "I spent my whole life building houses. But this, what we are building here, this feels stronger. This feels like it will last forever." Mateo looked at his father, at the man whose simple, unshakable integrity had been the foundation for it all. "That's because we're not just building with stone and wood anymore, Papa," he said. "We're building with justice." The small contractor and his son had not just won their own battle. They had forged a new legacy, a testament to the fact that the law, in the right hands, could still be a tool not for the powerful, but for the just.